You're listening to episode 245 of the Small and Supercharged podcast with Ria Freeman. Well, I am delighted to be joined on today's podcast by Ben Eagle from RuralPod Media, but you may know him better as the host of two brilliant podcasts. One is Meet the Farmers, and the second one is Rural Business Focus. I am pretty sure I've got that all correct.
You have, yes.
I was trying to shove a "the" in for no apparent reason at all, and then I panicked a bit. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ben. It's brilliant to have you here.
Well, Ria, it is an absolute joy. And I mean, we've been speaking for quite a while. I first came across you and through your podcast, because as you'll probably tell through today, I'm slightly obsessed with the podcast scene. During lockdown, I came across your work and I've been such a massive fan ever since. So it is a thrill, an absolute thrill to be on Small and Supercharged. I can't believe it.
Oh, thank you. And I know I've been on your podcast as well, and it was brilliant. So I'm really excited to have you here today. So take us back in time. Where did this all start for you? You've obviously got a huge background and a huge passion around agriculture. So can you talk to us about how this all started, how your journey began?
So I am generally interested in lots and lots of stuff, which can sometimes be a good thing, sometimes be a difficult thing, and sometimes I'll come across a path and think, oh, where does this go? Which is a sort of quite a good way of summarizing my life so far, I think. Um, but going a long way back, so my roots are in farming. My dad is I think fourth, maybe fifth generation farmer. He was a dairy farmer when I was growing up. So grew up with the cows. The cows were my best friends. And then I got very upset and angry with my parents when they decided to sell my best friends when I was uh, 9 years old.
Oh, wow.
And
That,
didn't really understand. I mean, the dairy sector in particular, farming in general in the 1990s was going through, I mean, a pretty terrible time. It was a pretty dark time in farming for lots of people, no matter what sector you were in, but especially in dairy. And it was a time when lots and lots of people left the industry. I think back then there were definitely more than 10,000 dairy farmers then. It's now more. It's pretty much halved since then. But it was a very dark time in farming, um, and I sort of grew up with that context of uh, sort of stressed conversations at home. Obviously, the cows going, lots of machinery being sold. The farm itself was completely transformed during that time as we shifted from a dairy farm. The cows were sold, yeah, and then we became an arable farm. But big changes. Lots of people left, all the animals left, and that was the context that I grew up in. And so, because of that, and I don't blame him at all. My dad, I would say, actively encouraged me to explore things away from farming
yeah.
as a potential future. And so, I grew up really with that in mind, and managed to avoid the farming world for quite a while. Um, but so when I left school, I didn't really know exactly what I wanted to do, because, like I say, I have lots of different interests, and I wasn't quite sure the direction I wanted to go in. But spent the first sort of few years after school exploring lots of different avenues. I did lots of travel. I went to China for a time. I went around Scandinavia for a time. Um, and I also dabbled in my first business venture, which was actually making beer. So I did
Excellent.
on a very sort of kitchen table type approach. Went and did a short brewing course. Did a load of homebrew, came up with some recipes, teamed up with a local microbrewery, then made it on a sort of batch scale, and then sold it into pubs and to events, and made lots of mistakes. Didn't really know what I was doing at the time. Um, and yeah, also in those years did lots of different things. I was up in Norfolk for a time. I doing an assistant at a school up there, doing everything from working in the music department to hockey training to yeah, teaching assistant, lots of things there. Um, and long story short, after that, I ended up going to Bristol University, to do a degree in history where I specialised in environmental history. And this was really the time when my real interest in the land, in wildlife, in farming, in conservation, that was all fostered. This was a really important time for me, both in terms of what I was studying, but also what I was doing on a practical level as well. So during that time, I spent pretty much all of my summers working on farms and also uh, Easter breaks, I remember that as well. I did quite a lot of lambing seasons. And this was really just a way of me getting to know my roots again. It felt like I had put a complete brick wall there,
Yeah.
um, that I didn't want to go past. But actually, when I went on to other farms and I started to realize, well, you know what? Not everywhere is like my experience growing up, and it's a great life. And apart from anything else, there was just a fascinating community. I became absolutely fascinated by farmers,
Yeah.
and what they do, why they enjoy what they're doing, what drives them. Um, and then similarly at that time as well, I was doing lots of volunteering for conservation organisations, for the National Trust, for Avon Wildlife Trust. Did some work for Bristol City Council as well. And as is sort of usual for anyone who's gone into the conservation sector, certainly back then, I hope that it's improved since then, but definitely, yeah. Back when I started, you had to do a lot of volunteering in order to get your first paid role.
Mm.
And I got a pretty lucky break really with my first paid role, which was with Essex Wildlife Trust. Um, yeah, coming out of uni, um, and that was in some ways a PR role. In terms of it was there was a visitor centre which was being built alongside a reserve. There hadn't been a member of staff on that particular site, I mean, for years. So this was all about fostering community, building a team of volunteers, and I learned so much at that time, both in terms of my practical knowledge of wildlife and conservation, but also people, how to deal with people, how to speak with people, how to build a team. What makes people work, what makes people angry, what drives emotion. And really through everything I've done, it has been my interest in people, which has driven it. Um, so I mean, I can keep on talking for forever on this if you want me to carry on. But
No, I'm very
do
happy. No,
yeah.
keep going. It's really interesting because I do think, it used to be in the olden days, you went into a job and you stayed in that job forever. And you maybe your family funneled you into it or what it was. But nowadays, people have got really interesting paths to get to where they are now. And
Mm,
I think it's really positive as well because you hear of lots of younger people coming out of school not having a clue what they're going to do, feeling that pressure to make that choice that they've almost got to, sign in blood. And that is not the case. The most interesting people I speak to, like your good self, have actually had a really interesting and diverse journey to
yeah.
get to where they are at this moment. And every experience we have, I hand on heart believe this, helps us to be better at the next step, even if it seems a bit left field. it Everything teaches you so much. So no, I'm
I
very
think it's
happy.
yeah.
Carry on. I'm
Super.
loving this.
No, I think that's such a good point, and certainly on my podcast as well. That's one of the things that I love people who have this sort of diverse background. I find it absolutely fascinating, sort of the decisions that you make and the reasons why you choose to down different paths. So anyway, I through this role with Essex Wildlife Trust, but while I'm there, I'm still fostering my interest in farming. And at this point, actually, had I started? No, I hadn't started the podcast at this point. Um, but I was going out onto lots of different farms. I was meeting lots of different farmers. For the first time, really, um, I was engaging with the farming community, which, despite coming from a farming background,
Mm,
um, and early on in my life, it was a big part of my life. But I had this big gap, which I felt like I was catching up in many ways. But during this time, while I was while I was working in the conservation sector, I had conversations with my colleagues about farming. And similarly, I was also very much involved at that time with a youth conservation network called the Focus on Nature, which is almost a bit like the Young Farmers for young conservationists in a sort of way. It was founded by an amazing lady called Lucy McRobert, who actually went on to become head of communications at the Wildlife Trust. Um, but yeah, so I was heavily involved in that at that time, and with my farming hat on, I started exploring this far more, and I started thinking about the ways that certainly people in conservation at the time were talking about farming, the way we were engaging with farming issues, the way we were engaging with farming conversations. And I just felt those we weren't really listening to what the farmers were saying. Or that was my perception at the time, that it may well have been happening, but certainly that was not what I was perceiving. That was not what I was experiencing at the time. So I sort of reimagined my future at that time. And I knew that I wanted to have an element of agriculture in my life.
Mm.
But how did I get that back? Um, the family farm is still there, and it's still there now. And d- dad is on the farm. Dad was on the farm back then, but because of all the changes we'd gone through, it wasn't really, certainly back then, it wasn't possible to for us both to be working on the film, and to actually have an income from it. Um, so I thought, right, how do I do this? And that was when I thought, okay, I need to almost I need to go through a shift of mindset in my head. And the way that I did that at that time was I applied for various different agriculture courses. I had some practical experience by that point on all these other different farms. So I ended up going to the Royal Agricultural University at Cirencester for a 1 year, 1 year agriculture course, which is like doing it. It's in essence like doing the degree in 1 year, and you could pick sort of different subjects from all sorts of parts of across the university, and we did lots of farm visits, and that was a real shaper of a year. And it was at that time that I started the Meet the Farmers podcast. And that was very much it was started with my conservation hat on. So it was started partly to tell those farming stories to a conservation audience, and I didn't really see the wider opportunity at the time. But it was also a way of me going out onto farms and learning,
Mm.
because again, I just felt I had so much to learn, and I was starting from absolute scratch. So it was a really good way. Um, and podcasting with me was so unknown at that time. I can't even remember how I think I oh, no, no. So how I got to know about podcasting was through a really good friend of mine, who was actually the boyfriend, now husband, actually, of someone I was living with when I lived in Bristol, and he told me about these things called podcasts, uh, which was a recorded conversation or a recorded interview, which then you put on a platform, and then it went off to the world. And I thought, well, you know what? I've yeah, let's give this a go. Let's give this a go. And I got in touch with some friends, my early episodes, which are so terrible. If I
Sure
listen,
they're not.
if I
Sure they're not.
listen, if I listen back to those first episodes, like, what was I thinking? But yeah, you learn as you go. Um, so yeah, so that's when Meet the Farmers started. And through all that time as well, I was doing a lot of writing. I've always loved writing, right way back to when I was really quite young, actually. I've always been a big reader, big writer. Words have been very, very important for me as a way of, I suppose, either explaining how I've been feeling or how I see the world. So writing has always been important as well. So I don't know whether I'm getting this across, but I think there's, it's all these sort of different layers and levels that all sort of slowly started coming together. Um, so yeah, so this is we're talking now like sort of early mid 2010s, I suppose. Yeah.
So that was
Um,
really before podcasts, because nowadays podcasts are super
yeah,
well known, but actually
yeah.
that time, not so much. They were just sort of starting to be of interest, weren't they?
Oh, completely, completely, and it wasn't really until 2020 and the pandemic, which has completely transformed the podcasting space. Back then, it was very much a niche thing, and even even listeners within your niche wouldn't have even an exclusive thing, and it was a sort of a space that not many people engaged with.
Yeah.
So it is interesting thinking back to that time. And back then as well, I wasn't even in the early days uploading through a hosting platform. I was just uploading onto my website at the time, and doing all the uploading manually. Um, so I came through that, and I went through quite a difficult time. Um, in when was this? This must have been 2017, I think was my hard year. Um, when I was working on a project, come out of Cirencester. I was working on a project which was really fascinating between Bristol University, National Trust, down on the Honeycutt estate in Exmoor. And we
Mm.
were, in essence, taking the whole estate. It was a big estate with lots of different farms, and the National Trust back then were looking at a thing which they called spirit of place, which sounds quite woo-wooey, but actually it was it was quite an interesting way of seeing a whole estate. So they were looking at what this place means for various different people, why people visit it, why people live there, why people work there. It was all about the why, and it was all about the people element, and through that process, I did lots and lots of different interviews, and that was a key time actually for me for honing my skills as an interviewer, and it was a key time actually also when I really actually found I really like interviewing people. I really find because I find people so fascinating, I really like this process of getting to understand, and how you shape a story through an interview and all of that stuff. So that was a key time. Um, but that project came to an end, and I'd been applying for jobs before then, because I knew that it was coming up, and I just came up after there was a brick wall, and then another brick wall, and then
Yeah.
another brick wall, and then another brick wall, and another one, and so on and so forth. And my relationship at the time broke down. Um, it was a really horrible, horrible time. But when I look back on it now, it was one of the best times of my life, because I learned so much from that time. I took so much of that time. I grew so much from that time.
Yeah.
Um, and when I was going through that, it got to the stage when, and I think caveating that as well is I didn't know anything about mental health at that point at all. I didn't know it was a thing. Um, so when I was going through what was in essence, I had anxiety and depression at the time, but driven also by a difficult situational time. Um, but when I was going through it, the only place that I knew to go to, the only place that I had to go to, was the family farm, and that's where I went back to. And that time was a real shaper. There were some very dark days, but it was the farm that helped me bring that back. It was the farm and running, actually. I became a runner at that point. But the great thing about farming is that you've got to get out of bed. You've got to go and do things.
Yes. Yeah.
There are set
Absolutely.
tasks that you have to do. And shortly after coming back to the farm, actually, when I was feeling slightly better in myself, I bought into with a mate of mine, but bought into his sheep flock, and yeah, we ran I think about 150 ewes straight into lambing season, and it was those sheep that really helped me because again I had to be there for them, um,
Yeah.
and it was also a time when I spent more time on our farm then than I had for years. And I really got to know it so, so well. I got to love it. It became a big part of me. And each individual field, um, the farm itself. So we're on the Essex coast. We've got 3 miles of sea wall, so we're right on the coast, and about 60% of the farm is below sea level, and
Oh,
it's
wow.
long-term threat from sea level rise as well. So in the long run, we we live with that stress and that knowledge that that land is going to go. So it's but we need to maintain those sea walls, and the sea walls are there at the moment, but there is that long-term threat. But anyway, so yeah, a lot of marshland, beautiful landscape. We border the Pamford Water National Nature Reserve, where we have seals, and with
Oh,
the most
wow.
easterly peninsula in Essex as well. So many migratory birds, which again, this all had, looking back, this had a massive influence in my interest in wildlife and conservation, because we have so much of it. We have
Yeah.
so much of it on the Essex coast. The Essex is such a, I'm going off on a tangent here, but Essex is such a maligned county. It's such a misunderstood county. It can be incredibly wild. There are places on the Essex coast, especially, that are so remote. You feel, yeah, you feel in the absolute sort of the depths of wildness. Robert McFarlane, in particular, has written some brilliant stuff about the Essex coast. One of my favourite books of all time, written by J.A. Baker, The Peregrine, is based on the Essex coast as well. So it's a big part of me is Essex, and my love for it, and its diversity as a county, but also from a people point of view as well. People from Essex are quite independent. Certainly, people from my part of Essex are quite independent minded, and they're quite go getters, and they speak their mind as well, which is what I like about this part of the world. But anyway, cutting a long story short, so yeah, I come back to the farm, and yeah, this has a massive impact on me. While I'm on the farm as well, the podcast is still going.
Yeah.
So at that point as well, I am there. They were also the first, I think the first 80 odd, 85 odd episodes of Meet the Farmers. They were all done on location, and I did that on purpose because again, I was doing it as a way of meeting farmers and understanding farming and understanding farmers as much as I could. So through all this time as well, I was going on journeys like all over the place whenever I could get some time. Which was, if I look back, it was pretty mad, because I don't know. Yeah, I barely slept a lot of the time, because I was on the farm. Then I was going straight off to a farm in, I don't know, Yorkshire, or went to one up near in Snowdonia. Drove from Essex, picked up a
Wow.
mate of mine in Herefordshire, and then we drove up to Snowdonia, up to North Wales, and then back again. We did all that in 2 days, and there was just this was happening
Extraordinary.
all the time. So, which, again, from a mental health point of view, I now look back and think this was not healthy.
It's
This
tricky though,
this
because
this was not a
pre
healthy thing to do.
I think now, obviously, post pandemic, she says, hanging on to wood, but now we do so much more remotely, and everyone is
Yeah,
more aware of the possibility of remote. Like now we're chatting on Zoom.
yeah,
I haven't driven across the country to talk to you, or vice versa. But actually, pre-COVID, these long journeys were just what you did. Maybe not quite
yeah,
that
they
extreme,
were.
because Essex to Snowdonia is quite a trek. But
It,
rather than now, I've had so many meetings where I think, gosh, pre-COVID, it would have been okay, I'll come up and see you, and it's 3 hours in the car and 3 hours back for an hour's meeting, and that was just the done thing, which
yeah,
is mad. I mean, it's mad from a time point of view, but also actually an environmental, and as you say, mental health, fatigue, tiredness, so many things. But yeah, I can understand it does seem a little bit crazy looking back on it now, but equally, I think that was more how things were done.
no, I completely agree. It was. I think it's very easy to underestimate the influence that COVID has had, the influence that the lockdowns has had on our mindsets, on our ways of thinking, on the way that we see our society, our culture, our way of life, the way that we go about our day to day, has been massive. And it's
Mm.
so easy to forget that. It really is. If you sort of think back, yeah, 2018, 2019, even before that as well, we were living different life. You look at the commute, you look at those sort of different entities that we explored, the way that we lived our lives, they have changed significantly. And I definitely
Absolutely.
saw that in myself back then. When I think back to it, I just wouldn't do that to that extent now. And the strange thing is, I remember having my first Zoom call before COVID with I used to so whenever with my journo hat on, whenever I used to do calls to the Netherlands, I would always do it on Zoom because
Mhm.
that's what they used, which is really bizarre. And that was when I'm pretty sure it was Zoom. It might have been another platform, but I'm sure it was Zoom. And yeah, so I knew that it existed. We all knew that well, it did exist, but we didn't use it because we didn't have to.
Mhm.
That was what the pandemic did.
Definitely. Sorry, so I cut you off. I was campaigning for shorter journeys and more use of
That's fine.
Zoom. But sorry, so you're traveling all over the place to do these interviews from Essex because that a lot of places, particularly farm based, I would imagine, and are you think when you think farming, well, I think more of those kind of counties with more big open spaces, but that could just be a very incorrect view.
No, I think you're right. And it's the thing about farms is that they are by their very nature, every single one is different. And you do get to go to the most incredible locations that there's no way that you would go to otherwise.
Mm,
Um, and that's I find I've got to know this country. I've got to know the UK really well through Meet the Farmers, because all the subtleties of each individual county. There are still some counties out there that I haven't been to, that are still on my list, but they're few and far between now. I want to do more. I want to see more of Scotland for sure. Um, but yeah, I actually had a Scottish girlfriend for quite a while, so I spent quite a lot of time up there. Yeah, but no, it is amazing, this country. It's so diverse, geographically, culturally, if you think of, yeah, language, accents,
yeah.
um, crossing to Wales, it's just Cornwall. Oh, it's just yeah, the Yorkshire Dales, the North Norfolk coast, the South Downs. It's just there are so many incredible places in this country, and I think for me it was another great thing about the pandemic is that it encouraged people to explore. And I know that there was certainly lots of talk, certainly in the farming community, and I mean our farm was inundated during the pandemic with people coming out into the countryside, but I fundamentally don't think that's a bad thing because I think generally, and I'll use a David Attenborough phrase, you've got to, what does he say? You've in order to care for something, you've got to understand it. In order to understand it, you have to experience it. And that was to a certain extent, that was what was happening then. Um, so yeah, no, it is. But I'll go back on the narrative. Um, where was I? Yeah, so we're still pre-COVID. Um, I'm back on the farm. And during this time as well, because of all the pressures that our farm has been under, and dare I say it, we were in a heck of a lot of debt when the
Mm.
cows were sold, a huge amount of debt, which has all had to be paid off over about 20 years. And that was always a challenge. And so dad, by his nature, has always been quite entrepreneurial, and I grew up with that mindset. Dad, I think, did diversification well before diversification became a thing. And in the 90s, from right the way from events, through to he's yeah he's had lots of ideas that haven't quite come out, but there have been lots of ideas tried. And we had a model aeroplane club on the farm, which is still there actually from very early time. Must be there since the 80s. Um,
Mm.
uh, and so during when I was there, I thought, okay, what else can I do? Um, and that was when, in addition to our main diversified crop on the farm, which is called sea buckthorn, which if we had about 3 hours, I would probably go on to talk about an hour about that. But we grow that, which is a niche berry crop. Um, but also, I mentioned earlier that I got very into running um, during my really quite dark times as a way of making myself sort of literally get out really.
Yeah.
um, and running really, really helped me, both. And I'm a massive believer in physical and mental fitness. being hand in hand, which actually has been something that I do quite a lot of on the Rural Business Focus podcast, actually. But yeah, so big believer in that. And I met two local guys at that time, who one of whom was a PT, had a fitness background, and one of who was a real entrepreneur, owns multiple businesses, and had this idea of um, really creating a space in the countryside that could get people out onto a farm. And it was a time also when mud runs were a big thing. Mud runs
Yeah.
are still quite a big thing, but they were taking off. So the idea was to create a like a permanent mini um, mud run round a field on a farm. Um, but that was always the goal, which we did achieve. In the early days of that, we thought we didn't have any money at the time, so we thought, how on earth can we get people to know about this? And we knew about Parkrun, obviously.
Yeah.
So then we thought, well, why not Farm Run? And that was where Farm Runner was born. And the basic idea behind this was we put out posts on social media. So we had a route across the farm, which was about there was a 2K, a 2 kilometer track and a 5 kilometer track. We put loads of signs out. We did the risk assessment, all the usual stuff.
Yeah.
And we said we're going for you can walk, jog, or run this course on a Sunday morning at 10 o'clock, I think it was, or 9 o'clock. Um, please turn up. And the first week it was just us. The second week we had one person who came along. The next week, I think we had 4 or 5 people who came along. And then it just doubled and doubled and doubled and doubled and doubled as the weeks went on. And
Mhm.
eventually we had nine 100 people running this course, all meeting on a Sunday morning on the farm. We brought people to the farm. That community aspect was really, really important, certainly to me, but to all of us. And we
Mhm.
built this little running community on the farm. And I learned a lot about that time again, about uh, the importance of community. Community has been a massive part of me and what I stand for, I think. And I believe in the power of communities so much, in building communities, whether those are real communities, in-person communities. That could be through, in that case, through a sport, or an interest, or in a local community where you live, or they can be virtual communities, um, like with podcasting, I suppose, with
Mhm.
social media, the social media space as a virtual space. Um, so yeah, so that was a big learning point for me, too. Still on the farm, but at this time, and then which definitely I've gone through a process of taking more stuff on again. So at that stage, I had my sort of farm hat on, I had my podcasting journo hat on. I now had this new business hat on as well, and it was yet again. It's actually it's a lesson that I've learned relatively recently. Actually, it is more to actually you need to find focus, which is cutting a long story short. That's partly where the Rural Business Focus podcast came from. Was an exploration for me and a shift for me that actually, no, Ben, you need to focus. You need to actually think, what is it in life that you really want to do? Where is your space? Where can you give the most value? Um, but I think I had to go through all of these things and do all this stuff in order to get to that space. And unfortunately, I think I just got I learned I didn't learn the lesson the first time when I was doing too much stuff and I burnt out back in 2017. So I did go through a bit of a burnout stage again. But at that time I'd already learnt the lessons and I knew I could recognize what was happening, and I knew that I had to take action. And I knew then there was there was this whole idea bubbling away in the back of my head of my comms work, my communications work, my podcasting work. The podcasting had really taken off during lockdown, and that was when the first time that other people started approaching me and saying, "Oh, Ben, you've got knowledge of this podcasting malarkey. can you give us a hand with starting this, or do you want to present this, or can you edit this for me, or can you just give me some pointers of where I'm heading? And without really knowing at the time, that was where the seed of the idea came that actually, you know what? Podcasting, which is really taking off, and it gives real value to people. It's actually, there is some value here, which it's fostering. And there's particular value for the rural community, which is by its very nature, it challenges and it tackles a lot of those issues because people are by their very nature, they're quite remote. They're looking for connection. Connection is so important for us as just as human beings on that sort of level. But in the rural community, it's particularly important, I think, to actually connect with others because a lot of the time you're not seeing a lot of other people. You're not able to connect with other people. So through the podcasting space, that was possible. And that was another, as another ding, that was another lesson, another learning point, another process of learning points that I went through 2020, 2021, really understanding that. Um, the fact that I think I still felt, and I still feel, I'm currently not on the farm. Um, and for now, I may well go back. But I've stepped away for now. But back then, I really wanted to find a way. I really, really wanted to find a way of being on the farm, building my diversification businesses and doing my communications work, which was the stuff that I was really passionate about. Really, I was passionate about all three, but I was particularly passionate about the communication stuff and the farm, really. But the farm was there. At that point, the farm's future was pretty safe at that point. So it was like, okay, do I want to foster this? And everything came to a head. Uh, um, and I made my decision near the beginning of last year. So this is beginning of 2022, and 2022 was it was a big year for me personally, for lots of reasons as well. There was lots of other stuff going on, but making that decision to focus on fostering this community and building my interest and my links with podcasting, I suppose, and how I can help other people through this media and foster this media. Um, it's a relatively early stage still, for podcasting as a media, let alone just generally, let alone within the rural space. So I made that decision and took that leap, and I'm so glad I did that. And I've had, um, f- I've been lucky. What I love about the rural space, as you will know, Ria, as well. What I absolutely love about the rural space is the people, is the community. There are so many fantastic, and I know I'm biased. I know I'm biased, and I know I spend all my time in this space. But there are some really special people in this community, some really amazing people, some really driven people, some really inspiring people with inspired ideas and a real determination, but also with great values. Come across so many people along those lines. And and then so the last year, both with so I'm spending now it's probably about 80% of my time podcasting and 20% of my time writing, as a freelance journo, for various publications. In essence, whoever will take me. Um, but yeah, so and that's been the last year. And then literally just in the last couple of weeks, I've launched my podcast agency, RuralPod Media, which has been launched really with the whole mission behind this is working to make rural stories mainstream, but also it's enabling people and helping people to explore podcasting and how it can help their businesses, their organizations to reach their communities and build that community. So there's a huge amount in there, and I probably waffled on for ages, Ria. But I hope that's given some context.
Absolutely. I mean, I've enjoyed every minute, so that's all good. No, I think you're right because actually, Meet the Farmers is really useful for people who are in the agricultural space, but it's also really good for people that aren't to get an understanding of it. Particularly in kind of inner city areas, they didn't really realise the link between the farming and the food. But it is important to share those stories so people are educated, not just go, oh yeah, well, farmers are all rich, they've got loads of land, they've got loads of animals. but the amount of work it takes. And I was speaking to a lady actually just a couple of weeks ago. She's only got a small holding, but she's got something like 5 or 6 sheep. And she was
Yep.
saying how much it costs to have the sheep sheared, and then
Yep.
that there's absolutely no value in the fleece, so they have to burn the fleece.
Yep.
And I
So
think
ridiculous.
so, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like it was, a couple of quid to have a sheep sheared,
Yep.
which you think that's not much. It is if you've got hundreds or thousands of sheep. If you're just having to burn that product because it's got no value, but for welfare grounds, you have to do it. Normal
Yep.
people who aren't involved in this space won't understand that. They'll think, well, you shear the sheep, you sell the wool, you make a load of money. You don't. And I
Mm.
was really shocked by that. I think she was saying, even a good fleece is worth, say, 50 pence, or these figures might not be correct, but it was basically the farmer makes a loss.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it fluctuates with wool. The price fluctuates like any commodity, but generally, most of the time, you are making a loss on every fleece that you shear, which is
Yeah.
just for me, it's one of the it's one of the biggest travesties in agriculture that we haven't been able to solve that issue. And there are some amazing people. There really are there's some great stories actually out there of people who are working to tackle this. And there is, to a certain extent, there are some cases where you're able to add value, but in the main, yeah, that's a real it's a real issue. But you've hit a chord there, and I think certainly understanding. Yeah, for me. This is about understanding people. In this particular case, it's farmers, but it's like, how much do we really how much do we really understand about anyone who's not from our own background,
Not
really?
much. Not much, in all
Exactly.
honesty, because we view everything
Exactly.
through our own lens.
Yeah. Yeah, and
And
that's what I love about podcasting, is that you've got the capacity to just explore so many different communities and different types of people and different ideas if you want to.
mm, and I think, I mean, I know it's not podcasting, and you might disagree with me, but that's completely fine. I think Clarkson's Farm has actually been a really good thing. I know whether you like or loathe Jeremy Clarkson, I think he's quite funny. Um, but I have found that whole experience really eye-opening. And we live very rurally. We've got a farmer on 3 sides of our house. I chat to him. I usually say crazy things I don't mean to about his sheep, because they yell at me when I walk the children to school. Um, and I used to have a horse that lived on an organic farm where I used to work. We had a pig. There was a pig farm. And so I feel like I'm fairly, like, I get the landscape to a degree, but I found Clarkson's Farm completely enlightening about the struggles that somebody with his money, with a TV crew following him around, faces. And from TB being a huge concern with the cows, to every aspect of it. And I think that those kind of things are so useful to everybody to really understand more about the process. And when you've also got things like podcasts that are making it more into the mainstream, it just helps to educate people more about the challenges that are being faced.
Oh, I'm so pleased you've said that, Rhea, because for me, Clarkson's Farm, and yes, he's a controversial character, and um, yeah, but I think taking the just purely from a communications point of view, Clarkson has done more.
Yeah.
Clarkson's done more through that series for the face of farming and people's general understanding of farming than all the rest of us have done for years and years and years. It's unbelievable. The audience that he's managed to tap into would have been unreachable in so many cases. And farming is becoming it's becoming an interest something that is actually interesting to people, which is, yeah, other than Country File, which comes out every Sunday, and again, certainly farmers have different views on that. I personally still think that it's great that we actually have something
Mm.
every Sunday that's actually going into people's living rooms every week. That some of that content of the countryside is being pushed through. Um, but yeah, I think Clarkson's done a huge amount, an absolute massive amount for farming PR.
Yeah, I think, and then, as you say, if people can then listen to more stories through podcasts, through other channels, it just allows that expanding of education, and I think it breaks down the barriers as well, because if there has been this divide before, it's then very difficult if just some person tries to reach out. You think, well, why are you doing that? You're trying to catch me out, because I think we are all a little bit
Yeah,
suspicious by
yeah,
nature. Um, and I think we can, bridge that divide and just have an understanding. You don't have to understand every aspect of people's lives, but just understand the kind of things they go through. At the moment, we've obviously there's quite a few lambs knocking around here, but you see on the news that people are letting their dogs off in fields with lambs, and farmers are getting absolutely irate, quite rightly, because it's quite literally killing their sheep or killing their
yeah,
lambs, causing sheep to abort and God knows what. And you just think, well, hang on, you need to have an understanding there. You might not agree, you might not even eat meat, but you shouldn't be doing that. Just keep your flipping dog on a lead or walk somewhere else.
yeah, yeah.
It's a
So
sheep
true.
field. Come on.
So true. Yeah, I mean, and lambing's a stressful enough time anyway for a farmer. They're probably really sleep deprived.
Yeah.
So it's just a lot of this. It's just about empathy, isn't it? It's about
Mm,
putting, which I think just feeling. Yeah, I keep on going back to that bigger society element, but it's my one big wish that if we had a society where people actually just properly just think of other people as you would just treat my grandmother, who was one of my favorite people in the whole world. One of the things she always used to tell me when I was growing up was treat other people as you want to be treated yourself. It's not rocket science. It's
no.
really not rocket science. But to know, I just get the capacity. I just get the feeling that we don't do enough of that. We really don't do enough of it.
No, and I was getting one of my questions here is obviously, you're heavily involved with with farmers, with agriculture, and also with the conversation. Well, yeah, but conservation side too. And I was going to say, what tips do you have? But I think, as you say, a lot of it isn't actually rocket science. It's just looking at from shutting a gate behind you. If there's animals in the field, shut the gate. Or actually, if the gate's shut the gate. It's You don't know why the gate's shut. Shut the gate.
Yeah.
It's
Absolutely. It's those simple things that honestly, on a day-to-day level, they make so much difference. That could add like half a day, potentially it could add half a day's work onto onto someone's workload. If it's say in a remote location, and because you never know what's going to happen. I remember was it last year, maybe the year before, uh we had a gate left open, and the cattle that were in that field then escaped,
oh,
um, which was, to be honest, just downright dangerous.
yeah,
And it took a lot of time and a lot of people and a lot of effort to solve a situation that didn't need to happen in the first place.
yeah,
Um, so it's definitely gates. Just leave gates as you found them. Just try and be understanding. If certainly if you're living in the countryside, um, again, it's that community aspect as well, isn't it? I think just try and get to know your local farmer, if you have a
mm,
local farmer, um, and talk with them, because honestly, farmers love talking. It's
yeah,
it's one thing I've discovered, because they don't often speak to a lot of people. When you ask them a question, a lot of them, and I know I'm making a massive generalization here, but a lot of them will they love to actually talk about farming. It's one subject that they love to talk about. So just build that conversation. Go to an open farm Sunday. If you haven't, that's happening in June. Shout out
yes,
for Leafs Open Farm Sunday, everyone. And then the other thing I'd say is that certainly if you live in a city, say, or you live in a town or an urban environment, when you're thinking of food, every time you're eating, and again, this sounds like it's the most ridiculous, super simple thing, but try and actually sort of just link that food with the person who is growing it. And a lot of the time, that might not even be in this country. We import a lot of
mm,
food, is the reality. We live in a global food system. And it's one thing that certainly I want to actually start exploring with Meet the Farmers, is I want to do more international interviews. I want to start meeting farmers from other parts of the world, because it is very much an integrated process. The food system, I mean, I live and breathe this every day practically, but it is so immensely complicated. There are so many layers to it. There are so many people involved. There are so many the supply chain for whether it's a supermarket supply chain, even a local supply chain can be quite complicated in its own way. The other thing I would say is if you can buy direct from a farmer, because that makes a massive difference. Again, it might be stating the obvious, but there are so many people involved in that wider supply chain. If you want to support a farmer, buy direct. But at the same time, this is where the nuance in my argument comes in as well. You have to be aware of. It is important as well that we do support people in that wider supply chain. There might be people listening who are, I don't know, a haulier or it's all those other people. We're not just talking about farmers here. We're talking about all the people in the rural environment who work in that sort of layered system of farming. So it's really complicated. It's really complicated.
No, but again, it's good. I mean, I know we've got a farmer that goes one way round our fields, and then there's a chap the opposite side, and they're both really lovely.
Yep.
You know, they one of them shoots, and he sends me a message every time they're going to shoot because he doesn't want to upset my horses.
Yep.
And he came and spoke to me about it, and I'm like, oh, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine. He was so respectful. He's like, oh, if they're worried, I'll let you know. And I'm like, oh, bless you,
Yeah.
that's great. And he's been so kind. And the other farmer, bless his heart, I buy my hay from him, and he just like drops me off 10 bales when I ask him. And he's an absolute diamond. I mean, I did call his
Yep.
cows malevolent, but to be fair, they were. Um, got surrounded by a load of bullocks. I'm like, oh, this is awful. It was fine. And his sheep yell at me every morning when I walk the children to school. So we chatted, and I said to him, oh, your sheep shout at me every morning. And they went, well, what do they say? And I'm like, oh God. And I said, they say they're hungry. And he went, that's just sheep for you. I mean, they're in really good nick, and they're just really funny, but it's really lovely, actually. They're both really nice chaps, and it's nice having actually just good people around you, and who, you know, with you know, oh, I need some hay, oh, no worries. I phoned him, actually. It was on Easter Monday, which was bad, and I said, look, it's just because we went away for a couple of days, and I said, I need some hay, not necessarily now, but if I could have it by Wednesday. It was there like 3 hours later, and I was like, oh
Yep.
God,
Yep.
you know. And they're such good eggs, and you know, I think it is, and it's just by speaking to these people and asking them questions, and as you say, getting to know more about it. And I think the Meet the Farmers podcast, the Raw Business Focused, it's good ways to get a bit more of an understanding of that space. So if you do actually want to have a chat with a farmer without calling his cow malevolent, you've actually got something to say. And you know, can then get that conversation started to learn. I mean, I find the whole thing fascinating. You know, even just, you know, we just see the sheep being transported in trailers when they've lambed. That cracks me up every time I see it. It shouldn't do. It does. He put raincoats on his lambs a couple of years ago, like little biodegradable ones.
Okay.
Blew my mind. We had a very long discussion about that. But you know, farmers really do care about their animals. I know they are raised, sold for meat, etc., etc. But the care that goes into these animals, there's obviously always exceptions to the rule, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about
There are.
vast majority. The care and attention that goes into the animals, that goes into everything that they do, it's like an art form. And we need to be very respectful and very supportive of this.
That's really nicely put. Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah, it's and I think the more I know about them, the more I know about it, the more I see how they work, the more I'm in awe of it. And anything that can be done to help support that, support them, but also promote what they do, and kind of knock down those barriers of everyone feeling a bit cross about everything is super important. Now, as our time is coming to an end, is there anything?
Sadly.
I know. I'm quite sad. I could chat to you all day.
I know, same.
We'll have to have a follow-up. I'll have a follow-up.
I should just say, Ray, it's so nice being on the other side of the microphone.
You see, I'm not the biggest fan of that, because I kind
Really?
of, I don't know why though, because when I do kind of webinars and stuff, I love the kind of Q&A round. I don't know what's coming next. I live for those. But we'll have a follow-up. We'll have a part 2.
Yeah, we'll have to.
We'll have to, too right. So is there anything else? One thing you did mention actually before we started recording was about the stereotypes that people, I guess, attribute to the rural landscape. I mean, I think the podcasts are a great way to break those down. Have you felt that too?
Oh no, completely. And I think, and I've been having this conversation with quite a few people recently, but I think in some ways, actually, we can be our own worst enemies when it comes to the stereotypes. Because I mean, the stereotypes in some ways they don't necessarily need to be a bad thing. And actually, there's a lot of there's a lot of good stuff about being remote. Say the opportunities that we have in terms of where we live. We live in lots of beautiful places. But I guess I'm sort of erring towards the stereotype of, as rural business people, how we see ourselves, especially when it comes to growth mindset. And this is something I've become far more interested in, I would say, over in the last year. And again, when I launched the Rural Business Focus podcast last July, this was a key part of it. Um, yeah, I actually want to do a shout out as well, if that's okay, Ria,
Mm.
for Sam Harris's growth mindset podcast as well, which is I've taken quite a lot from that,
I'll
and
write that down.
similarly the whole layer of, I mean, there are so many good mindset podcasts out there, so outside of the big ones. But yeah, so anyway, so I think the stereotype of um I suppose what roles there are in the countryside, what the again, another thing that pandemic has done, and as everything digitalizes as well, the amount of opportunities for work that become open for people in the countryside becomes massively diverse. I was reading a report last week which actually showed that people who work in people who work in the agriculture sector broadly, which I assumed that it was quite a significant proportion of the rural workforce. It was minuscule. I can't remember the exact percentage, but it was the vast majority of people who live and work in the countryside work in other sectors. So I think probably just the message I'd like to send about stereotype is just have a think about how you see people in the countryside, how you see, if you're living in the countryside, how you see your life in the countryside, and how you see your own identity in the countryside, and then think how you could challenge that. How can you grow as a, certainly if you if you have a business, which I'm guessing a lot of your listeners will be running their own businesses.
Mm.
How do you ensure that you develop that growth mindset? What are those things? And I'm sure, again, we could probably spend another few hours just talking on this subject, but what can you do in order to develop that and not see those boundaries around you? Foster it, foster it no matter where you are. Um, and yeah, I suppose, yeah, just a call to sort of think about that, really.
No, that makes perfect sense. Now we need to know where we can find your podcasts and your website and everything else about you online. So shall we start with the overarching rural your new business?
Yeah, no, of course. Yeah. So RuralPod Media, the best place to go is head over to the website, which is ruralpodmedia.co.uk. And hopefully there's all the information on there that you should need if you're interested in getting involved in podcasting more on whatever scale, or if you already have a podcast. Um, even if even if I just love to hear from you if you run a podcast as well, because part of what I'm trying to do here is just foster rural podcasting generally. If because one of the things I love about podcasting is that one podcaster's success is everyone's success, because you build your niche. It's what
Yeah.
I love about the niche. So what we're doing right now, this is, yeah, this is great for both of us. I just love that community element. So yeah, so ruralpodmedia.co.uk. Sorry, that was a really long way of saying it.
No, no, it's all good. It's all good. And where can we find Meet the Farmers and Rural Business Focus?
Meet the Farmers and Rural Business Focus are both available, probably wherever you're listening to this podcast. So on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Is there anything else you would like to add before I let you carry on with your day?
Oh, the only other thing I would love to say is just a big thank you to you, Ria, for
Oh,
everything you do. Because honestly, I know I've said this to you before, but I want to say it publicly as well. And almost all, because I know how much benefit, I know how much you won't understand how much influence you had on me genuinely during when I was going through quite a dark time in 2020. but I know that generally in a positive light as well, you give so much drive and optimism and yeah, positivity to so many people, and you've helped so many small businesses. So that's all I want to say. Thank you to you.
Well, I'll pay you later, but thank you. Thank you. That's really, really kind. That's made my day, actually. If the rest of the day goes to hell, I'll be happy. So thank you very much for coming on. It's been brilliant to chat to you, and we'll definitely have a follow-up.
Oh, thanks, Ria.